In 2020, Americans bought more guns than any time in U.S. history, a staggering 21 million firearms in just 12 months. That's enough to arm every adult in Florida and Texas combined. Gun stores couldn't keep shelves stocked. Manufacturers couldn't produce fast enough. Background check systems crashed repeatedly. But now, the market has completely reversed, with sales plummeting to levels that have manufacturers scaling back production by over 36%. What happened? What drove millions of Americans, including nearly 5 million first-time buyers, to suddenly purchase firearms during a pandemic? And why is the industry now experiencing its biggest downturn in years? Today, we're diving deep into this dramatic market shift. In this video, we'll break down the unprecedented 2020 gun buying surge month by month, examine the perfect storm of social factors that triggered it, explore how the industry responded, analyze the current sales crash, and discuss what this all means for America going forward. Whether you're a gun owner, considering becoming one, or simply interested in understanding this significant cultural and economic phenomenon, this analysis will provide valuable context for one of the most dramatic consumer trends in recent American history. According to FBI background check data and industry analysis, Americans purchased an estimated 21 million guns in 2020, representing a staggering 73% increase from 2019 figures. Some estimates place this number even higher, with nearly 23 million gun purchases recorded. The FBI conducted an unprecedented 39.7 million background checks for gun purchases that year, a 40% increase over the previous record in 2019. To put this in perspective, in a single year, enough guns were sold to equip every active-duty military member worldwide several times over. These weren't just incremental increases. They represent the largest single-year jump in American gun ownership in modern history. The surge didn't happen uniformly throughout the year. Instead, distinct spikes correspond directly with specific national events. March 2020 saw 3.7 million background checks as COVID lockdowns began, more than 1 million additional checks than March 2019. When grocery stores ran out of toilet paper and basic supplies, many Americans suddenly perceived potential threats to security and supply chains. Brandon Wexler, owner of Wex Gunworks in Florida, described it as almost, as far as an analogy, like prepping for a hurricane. June and July 2020 marked another massive spike, with 3.9 million and 3.6 million background checks respectively, coinciding precisely with nationwide protests following George Floyd's death. December closed the year with another 3.9 million checks amid post-election uncertainty. Each of these spikes represented historical records that would have been newsworthy in isolation. Together, they created an unprecedented year for firearm purchases. Perhaps most notably, 2020 wasn't just about existing gun owners adding to their collections. Nearly 5 million Americans bought their first firearm that year. This represents one of the largest single-year expansions of the gun-owning population in American history. These weren't just typical gun enthusiasts either. Gun store owners reported unprecedented sales to women, minorities, and even politically liberal buyers who had previously opposed gun ownership. One first-time buyer told the media, "I've never owned a gun. I've never wanted a gun. I've never had a gun in my home," before explaining why 2020 changed her perspective. This demographic expansion has permanently altered the profile of American gun ownership. The year 2020 created what researchers at Vanderbilt University's Center for Medicine, Health, and Society called a perfect storm of crises that triggered unprecedented fear-based purchasing. No single factor explains the surge. Instead, a cascade of overlapping threats created a pervasive sense of uncertainty and vulnerability that drove millions to seek security through firearm ownership. As one expert noted, "What we saw in 2020 and 2021 were not sustainable from a market standpoint, precisely because they were driven by extraordinary circumstances that simultaneously elevated perceived threats while diminishing trust in traditional safety systems." The pandemic created immediate and visible disruptions to daily life. When basic necessities like toilet paper disappeared from shelves, it shattered Americans' sense of system reliability. Gun purchases spiked first in March when lockdowns began, as uncertainty about societal stability and supply chains peaked. A Northwestern University study found that Americans who contracted COVID-19 were significantly more likely to purchase firearms during this period. The pandemic also created economic anxiety as millions lost jobs, adding financial insecurity to health concerns. This combination of visible system failure, health threats, and economic uncertainty created a powerful cocktail of fear that drove many first-time buyers to gun stores. By summer, a new crisis emerged. Widespread protests following George Floyd's death, while largely peaceful, included instances of property damage and violence that received extensive media coverage. Gun sales reached their absolute peak during June 2020, directly corresponding with these events. The Northwestern study revealed that protest participants were 2 to 4 times more likely to purchase firearms than non-participants, with 23% of those attending Trump rallies or protests against COVID restrictions buying guns. The contentious presidential election added yet another layer of uncertainty. Gun policy has long been a politically divisive issue, and the deeply polarized election heightened concerns about potential civil conflict. This political dimension cannot be overlooked. Historically, gun sales increase during election years and when Democratic administrations are anticipated, due to fears of stricter gun control measures. The gun industry faced unprecedented demand it simply couldn't meet. Production lines ran 24/7, yet shelves remained empty. Background checks that normally took minutes stretched to hours or days due to overwhelming volume. Ammunition became nearly impossible to find, with online sales spiking over 300% during peak months. This supply-demand imbalance created additional anxiety among buyers, further fueling the panic buying cycle as consumers feared missing opportunities to purchase firearms before potential restrictions or continued shortages. The firearms industry recognized and capitalized on these fears. Marketing materials from the National Shooting Sports Foundation identified potential customer types like the anxious buyer, unprepared protector, and urban defender, explicitly acknowledging that fear-based messaging drives sales. Industry guides recommended targeting consumers who feel unsafe away from home, followed by feeling unsafe at home. Social media became a crucial advertising channel, with manufacturers using platforms like YouTube and Twitter to connect viewers directly to websites facilitating gun sales. Unsurprisingly, manufacturers and retailers experienced unprecedented profits. Black Friday 2020 set records that would stand until 2021. Many businesses expanded operations, opened new locations, or increased production capacity to meet demand. The industry added thousands of jobs and invested millions in new equipment. These business decisions made perfect sense during the surge, but would later create significant challenges when the market inevitably corrected. Fast forward to 2025 and the landscape has dramatically changed. Americans bought approximately 15.3 million guns in 2024, still historically significant, but representing a 30% drop from the 2020 peak. The first months of 2025 suggest this downward trend is accelerating. Gun manufacturers have scaled back significantly, with federal data showing production for the U.S. market has fallen 36% from peak levels, dropping from 23.4 million to 14.96 million guns annually. Several manufacturers have announced layoffs, facility closures, or production shifts to focus on accessories rather than firearms themselves. This decline aligns with historical patterns, showing gun sales tend to fall when Republicans hold the White House, as fears of stricter gun control measures subside. During Trump's first term, sales dropped 17% in the first 3 years, a pattern repeating now with his return to office. Congressional Republicans are currently pushing national concealed carry reciprocity legislation that would require states to honor concealed carry permits issued elsewhere. While this could potentially boost sales by expanding carrying opportunities, it hasn't reversed the overall downward trend. Perhaps most significantly, market saturation has become a major factor. With an estimated 26 million new gun owners since 2020, many potential customers already have the firearms they wanted. Gun dealers report that the market is now promotionally driven rather than fear-driven, with consumers waiting for deals rather than rushing to purchase at any price. As one industry analyst noted, crisis fatigue has set in, and the psychological urgency that drove panic buying has largely dissipated. For gun manufacturers, this sales crash represents significant financial challenges. Companies that expanded operations during the boom now struggle with excess capacity and inventory. Many have pivoted to focus on existing owners rather than new acquisitions, promoting accessories, ammunition, and upgrades instead of new firearms. Industry trade shows increasingly emphasize the recreational and sporting aspects of gun ownership rather than self-defense messaging that dominated during the surge. Tragically, as gun sales surged in 2020, so did gun violence. CDC data showed firearm homicides rose 35% during the pandemic's first year to the highest rate since 1994. Gun deaths exceeded 42,000 in 2020, with both homicides and suicides contributing to this toll. These statistics raise important questions about the relationship between increased firearm ownership and public health outcomes. One lasting impact of the 2020 surge is the transformed demographic profile of American gun owners. The substantial increase in women, minority, and first-time owners has permanently altered who owns firearms in America. This diversification of gun ownership creates new questions about how firearms are marketed, regulated, and discussed in public discourse, potentially reshaping long-standing political and cultural debates around guns. The 2020 gun buying surge represents an unprecedented chapter in American firearm ownership, one driven by a perfect storm of crises that created pervasive fear and uncertainty. The subsequent market correction reveals much about how temporary psychological states can drive permanent changes in consumer behavior and cultural patterns. While sales have declined from peak levels, they remain elevated compared to pre-pandemic baselines. The future of gun sales will likely be influenced by several factors: political developments, economic conditions, crime rates, and potential new crises. While the market has stabilized somewhat, the underlying drivers of gun purchases, security concerns, recreational interest, and political identity remain powerful forces in American society. Understanding these patterns provides valuable insight into not just consumer behavior, but America's complex relationship with firearms.